He filed for divorce a week after I donated my kidney to his mom. "You're too soft," he said. I looked him dead in the eye, then slid a red file across the table and turned away. He opened it slowly, and for once he didn't have a single thing to say. The divorce papers were still warm from the printer when Paul slid them across our kitchen table. 1 week. 7 days since I'd given his mother my kidney, and this was my thank you. But let me back up, because this story doesn't start with betrayal. It starts with love. Foolish, endless, one-sided love. "You're being ridiculous, Kimberly." Paul's voice cut through the morning silence as I handed him his coffee. Black, no sugar, exactly how he'd taken it for 8 years. I'd been suggesting we visit his mother more often. Mom doesn't need us hovering over her like she's some invalid. But I saw through his dismissive tone. Paul had always been uncomfortable with vulnerability, especially his own. When we first married, I thought his emotional distance was mysterious, even attractive. Strong, silent type and all that. I was 24 and naive enough to believe I could love him into opening up. Before we continue, I want to thank you for joining me in sharing these stories that matter. If you believe that kindness should never be taken for granted and that true love requires mutual respect, please consider subscribing. It's free and helps us reach more people who need to hear this. Now let's see how this unfolds. Our marriage had a rhythm, and I was the one keeping time. I balanced our checkbook while Paul focused on the big picture. I handled his dry cleaning, scheduled his dentist appointments, and smiled when he introduced me to colleagues as the wife who keeps me organized. The phrase made me feel useful then. Looking back, it makes me feel hollow. The pattern became clearer after his second job loss in 18 months. Paul had a talent for burning bridges, snapping at supervisors, missing deadlines, blaming others when projects failed. But somehow it was always the company's fault, never his. "They don't appreciate innovation," he'd say, pacing our living room after another termination. "I'm too forward-thinking for these corporate dinosaurs." I'd nod supportively while mentally calculating how long our savings would last. 3 months of groceries. 6 months of mortgage payments. I picked up extra shifts at the accounting firm, coming home exhausted to find Paul playing video games, claiming he needed to decompress before job hunting. "You're too nice, Kim," he'd tell me when I defended his behavior to my sister or covered for him at family gatherings. "You make excuses for everyone." I wore that label proudly. Too nice. Too giving. Too understanding. In my mind, these were virtues. Marriage meant sacrifice, didn't it? Partnership meant carrying your spouse when they stumbled. Ashley, Paul's mother, seemed to see right through my facade from day one. During our engagement dinner, she studied me with sharp gray eyes while Paul bragged about his latest business idea. Something involving cryptocurrency and energy drinks that made no sense even then. "And what do you think of Paul's plan, Kimberly?" Ashley asked, her voice carrying a weight I couldn't quite interpret. "I think Paul's brilliant," I replied automatically. "Whatever he decides, I'll support." Ashley's smile didn't reach her eyes. How refreshing. Unconditional support. For years, our relationship remained cordial but distant. She'd ask polite questions about my work and make appropriate comments about the weather. I sensed judgment in her pauses, disapproval in her careful word choices. When Paul would make cutting remarks about my cooking or my choice of movies, Ashley would watch my reaction with those piercing eyes. Everything shifted the autumn Ashley broke her hip. Paul was too busy with a consulting project to visit her in the hospital, so I went alone. I found her looking small and fragile in the narrow bed, her usually perfect silver hair disheveled. "You didn't have to come," she said, but her voice carried relief. "Of course I did." I adjusted her blanket and noticed she hadn't touched her dinner. "This looks terrible. Let me see if I can find you something better." I spent 3 hours that evening, tracking down decent food, helping her navigate insurance paperwork, and simply listening as she talked about her late husband. Paul called once, a 5-minute conversation where he asked if she needed anything and seemed relieved when she said no. From that day forward, something changed between Ashley and me. I started visiting twice a week, bringing homemade soup and staying for afternoon tea. She taught me to play bridge and shared stories about Paul's childhood, stories he'd never told me himself. "He was such a sensitive boy," she said one rainy Thursday, showing me old photo albums. "Too sensitive, perhaps. His father worried he'd never toughen up." "What happened?" I asked, studying a picture of 8-year-old Paul with a gap-toothed grin. Ashley's expression clouded. Life happened. Disappointment. He learned to protect himself by feeling less. I began to understand Paul's emotional walls differently. Not as strength but as armor. When I tried to share this insight with him, he brushed me off. "Mom's getting sentimental in her old age," he said. "Don't read too much into her stories." But I treasured those stories. They helped me see glimpses of the man I'd fallen in love with, the one I kept hoping would resurface. The day Ashley collapsed changed everything irrevocably. I was at work when Paul called, his voice strangely flat. "Mom's in the hospital. Kidney failure. They say it's been building for months." I dropped everything and met him in the ICU waiting room. Ashley looked impossibly small among the machines, her face gray and drawn. The doctor explained her condition in clinical terms: end-stage renal disease, dialysis, transplant list. "Family members should consider testing for compatibility," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Living donors often provide the best outcomes." Paul stepped backward, actually stepped away from the conversation. I watched his face close off, that familiar shuddering I'd seen 1,000 times before. "I'll get tested," I said immediately. "When can we start the process?" Paul's reaction wasn't gratitude, it was panic. "Kimberly, that's major surgery. You could have complications. What if something goes wrong?" His concern felt hollow, performative. Later, as I filled out medical forms, I realized he wasn't worried about my safety. He was worried about responsibility, about owing me something he couldn't repay. The compatibility tests took 2 weeks. 2 weeks of watching Ashley grow weaker while Paul found excuses to avoid the hospital. Work meetings. Important calls. Anything but sitting beside his dying mother. When Dr. Martinez called with the results, I was alone in our kitchen. Paul was upstairs, door closed, claiming he needed quiet to work. "You're an excellent match, Mrs. Chin. Remarkably compatible. We can schedule the surgery within the month." I should have felt scared. Instead, I felt purpose. Finally, something I could do that mattered absolutely. Paul's response when I told him was telling. "Maybe we should think it through. Consider all the options. There might be other donors." But there weren't other donors. There was just me, and a woman who'd become more like a mother to me than my own absent mother ever had. That night, lying in bed beside my silent husband, I realized something had shifted irreversibly. Paul's inability to act, to give, to sacrifice. It wasn't just disappointing anymore. It was revealing. I was about to give Ashley my kidney. And Paul was already calculating what it would cost him. The pre-surgical paperwork felt heavier than it should have in my trembling hands. 12 hours until they wheeled me into the operating room, and Paul sat across from me on our couch, thumbs dancing across his phone screen like nothing monumental was about to happen. "The consent forms are pretty intense," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "They have to list every possible complication. Bleeding, infection, blood clots." I paused, waiting for him to look up. He didn't. "Death." Paul's thumbs stopped mid-scroll for exactly 2 seconds before resuming its mechanical rhythm. I set the papers down on the coffee table with more force than necessary. "Paul, I'm scared. You don't have to do this, you know." The words came out flat, almost irritated, like I was inconveniencing him with my anxiety. "There are other options. Dialysis can buy time. Other donors might surface." Other donors. Like his kidney wasn't an option that had ever crossed his mind. "She's your mother," I whispered, disbelief creeping into my voice. "And you're my wife." Paul finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "I'm just saying, nobody's forcing you into this. It's your choice." But the way he said it, like he was washing his hands of responsibility, like he was giving me permission to back out so he wouldn't have to feel guilty about his own inaction, made my stomach twist. I spent that night staring at the ceiling while Paul snored beside me. Every few minutes I'd touch my side where they'd make the incision, trying to imagine the hollow space that would remain. I wasn't just giving Ashley my kidney. I was giving her a piece of myself that Paul couldn't, or wouldn't, provide. At 5 a.m. I gave up on sleep and made coffee with shaking hands. Paul found me at the kitchen table, still in my pajamas, clutching my mug like a lifeline. "You're up early," he said, already reaching for his work clothes. I couldn't sleep. I studied his face, searching for any sign of the man I'd married. Will you stay with me today? Before we have to leave for the hospital?" Paul checked his watch. a gesture that would replay in my mind countless times afterward. I've got that conference call with the Peterson account at 9. It's been scheduled for weeks. The Peterson account. A potential client who probably wouldn't even sign with him. More important than the woman about to undergo major surgery to save his mother's life. Right, I managed. Of course. At the hospital, Paul paced the pre-op area like a caged animal while I changed into the surgical gown. The fabric felt thin and vulnerable against my skin. A nurse named Maria helped me onto the gurney, her hands gentle as she adjusted the 4-line. Your husband seems nervous, she observed kindly. I glanced at Paul, who was now checking his phone again. He's processing in his own way. Ashley appeared in the doorway, pushed in a wheelchair by another nurse. Despite everything, the dialysis, the weakness, the fear, she'd insisted on seeing me before surgery. Her face was drawn but determined. I had to see you, she said, reaching for my hand. Her fingers were cold but surprisingly strong. I keep thinking about what you're doing and Her voice cracked. I never expected this from you. Thank you, sweetheart. Tears spilled down her cheeks and suddenly I was crying too. Not from fear but from the overwhelming realization that this woman, this complicated, distant woman I'd spent years trying to win over, had become family in a way Paul never fully had. I love you, I whispered and meant it completely. Ashley squeezed my hand. I love you too, daughter. Paul cleared his throat from the corner. They're ready for you, Kim. No embrace. No kiss. No words of encouragement. Just a statement of fact delivered while his eyes remained fixed on the clock above the nurse's station. The anesthesia mask descended over my face, and the last thing I saw was Ashley's tear-streaked face mouthing thank you, while Paul stood behind her, already reaching for his phone. I woke up in a fog of pain and medication, my side burning with each breath. The recovery room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors. Through the haze I heard voices, a doctor speaking to Paul in the hallway. The surgery went perfectly. Both patients are stable. Mrs. Chin should be able to go home in a couple of days, though she'll need several weeks of recovery time. That's great, Paul's voice drifted back. Really great. Listen, I need to step out for a while. Work emergency. You understand. A work emergency. On the day of my surgery. The next 24 hours blurred together in a cocktail of pain, medication and loneliness. Paul visited twice. Once to bring me a change of clothes he'd hastily stuffed into a grocery bag, and once to tell me he'd be tied up with the Peterson presentation tomorrow. I'll be fine, I told him, though speaking made my incision throb. Go handle your business. He left without kissing me goodbye. That evening, Maria wheeled in a gorgeous arrangement of white lilies and purple orchids. My heart lifted for a moment, thinking Paul had surprised me. These are from Mrs. Chin in room 314, Maria said, adjusting the flowers on my bedside table. She wanted to make sure you knew how grateful she is. Not from Paul. From Ashley. The woman who just received my kidney was sending me flowers while my own husband was home, catching up on emails. By the second day I felt strong enough to walk the halls. Against the nurses' protests, I made my way to Ashley's room in the transplant wing. She was sitting up in bed, color already returning to her cheeks, reading a mystery novel. You shouldn't be walking around yet, she scolded gently, but her smile was radiant. I had to see how you were doing. I eased myself into the visitor's chair, wincing slightly. I'm doing wonderfully thanks to you. Ashley set her book aside and studied my face. Paul didn't come today either, did he? The question hung in the air between us. I could have lied, made excuses, protected him the way I always had. Instead, I found myself telling the truth. No. He said he had meetings. Something shifted in Ashley's expression. A flicker of pain that had nothing to do with her surgery. For the first time I saw her not as Paul's mother, but as a woman disappointed by her son's choices. I'm sorry, she said quietly. You deserve better. Those 4 words hit me harder than any of Paul's criticisms ever had. Coming from her, from the woman whose life I'd just saved, they felt like permission to acknowledge what I'd been denying for months. I did deserve better. Recovery at home was a solitary affair. Paul brought me soup from the deli and checked on me between phone calls, but there was a distance in his attention that felt almost clinical. Like he was fulfilling an obligation rather than caring for his wife. On the 7th day I finally felt human again. The incision was healing well and I'd managed to shower and dress myself without assistance. I even made dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta with marinara. But it felt like a victory. Paul came home that evening carrying a manila envelope, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk," he said, setting the envelope on the kitchen table. I turned off the stove, something cold settling in my stomach. "About what?" "About us. About this." He gestured vaguely at my healing body, at the quiet house, at the life we'd built together. "About what I need." That's when I noticed the papers peeking out of the envelope. Official letterhead. Legal formatting. "You're too soft," Paul said, his voice steady and cruel. "I need something stronger." The divorce papers were already signed. The divorce papers felt weightless in my hands, but the red file folder beside my purse carried the gravity of everything that mattered. I'd been carrying it for 3 days, waiting for this exact moment. Paul stood there expecting tears, expecting me to beg, expecting the same soft woman who'd always bent to his will. Instead, I reached for the folder. "Before you celebrate," I said, my voice surprisingly steady, "there's something you should see." The red file slid across our kitchen table with a whisper. The same table where we'd shared 8 years of breakfasts, where I'd balanced our checkbooks, where I'd pretended his silences were comfortable instead of cruel. Paul's eyes followed the folder's path, his confident smirk faltering slightly. "What's this supposed to be?" He reached for it hesitantly, like it might bite. "Open it." His fingers trembled just slightly as he lifted the cover. The first document was Ashley's medical discharge summary, stamped and official. Beneath that, a letter from Hartwell and Associates, the law firm that had handled his father's estate years ago. Paul's face went through a fascinating transformation as he read, confusion melting into disbelief, then hardening into something approaching panic. "This can't be legal," he whispered, flipping through page after page of notarized documents. "She can't just, this is her grief talking. She's not thinking clearly. She's thinking more clearly than she has in years." I settled back in my chair, amazed at how calm I felt. "Keep reading." The will was thorough, brutally, comprehensively thorough. Ashley's Victorian house on Maple Street, the one Paul had grown up in, the one he'd always assumed would be his someday. Mine. Her investment portfolio, carefully managed over 40 years of teaching. Mine. The antique jewelry collection she'd inherited from her mother, including the diamond ring Paul had promised would be mine anyway. Legally mine now. Even the baseball card collection from his childhood, the Mickey Mantle rookie card he'd bragged about to friends. Mine. But it was the personal letter attached to the will that made Paul's hands shake visibly. "Read it out loud," I said gently. "I'm not." "Read it." Paul's voice cracked as he began, "To my son Paul, you taught me that love is a choice, not an obligation. For 34 years I chose to love you despite your selfishness, your coldness, your inability to put anyone's needs before your own. I kept hoping you'd grow into the man I raised you to be. Instead, you became exactly the man you chose to be." He stopped reading, his face flushed. "She wrote this because she's angry. People say things. Keep going. When Kimberly offered her kidney without hesitation, and you stepped backward, I saw the truth I'd been avoiding. When she lay in that hospital bed recovering from surgery to save my life, and you worried about your work meetings, I understood who you really are. When she walked down that hallway, still healing from giving me her flesh and blood, just to check on me because you couldn't be bothered, that's when I knew." Paul's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "She became the daughter I always wanted, and you proved you were never the son I thought I had." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the wall clock, the same clock Paul had checked so obsessively at the hospital. He set the letter down like it was contaminated. "She can't do this. There are laws about." "About what?" "About a woman of sound mind deciding how to distribute her own assets." I leaned forward slightly. Mr. Hartwell was very thorough. Ashley underwent a full psychological evaluation before signing anything. She met with 3 different attorneys. Everything's ironclad. Paul's phone buzzed against the table. Without thinking, he reached for it. The same automatic gesture that had punctuated every important conversation we'd ever had. This time I caught his wrist. "She's not going to answer," I said. "I helped her change her number yesterday." "You what?" "She didn't want to hear your excuses anymore. Or your anger. or your attempts to manipulate her into changing her mind. I released his wrist and stood up, my healing incision pulling slightly with the movement. She said she's too old to waste time on people who don't value her life. Paul stared at me like I was a stranger. You orchestrated this. You poisoned her against me while you were what? Working? Avoiding her calls. Treating her kidney failure like an inconvenience. I gathered the papers into a neat stack. I didn't have to poison her against you, Paul. You did that all by yourself. He tried a different approach, the one that had worked for years. Kim, you know I love my mother. I was just stressed about the medical bills, the time off work. I was worried about providing for us. Us. The word came out sharper than I intended. Is that why you filed for divorce? Because you were so worried about providing for us. Paul's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. For 8 years he'd never been at a loss for words. He'd always had a criticism, an excuse, a way to make his failures someone else's responsibility. Now, faced with the mathematical precision of consequences, he was speechless. You didn't want me, I said, echoing Ashley's words from our last conversation. Now, your mother doesn't want you either. The truth of it settled between us like a weight. Paul had spent his entire adult life taking without giving, expecting loyalty without offering love, demanding sacrifice while providing none. He'd finally met the natural end of that philosophy. I could contest this, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. You could try. I moved toward the sink, needing something to do with my hands. But Ashley's already moved out of the house. She found a lovely apartment near Riverside Park, the one with the duck pond she always admired. She seems happier than I've seen her in years. Moved out? When? This morning. While you were at your very important meeting with the Peterson account. I turned to face him. She said she wanted to start fresh somewhere that didn't remind her of disappointment. Paul slumped in his chair, finally understanding the scope of what he'd lost. Not just money or property, but the fundamental security of knowing someone would always forgive him, always choose him, always be there regardless of how poorly he behaved. She starts a book club next week, I continued, unable to keep a small smile from my lips. She's already made 3 friends in her new building. Turns out she's quite charming when she's not worried about her son's approval. The divorce papers lay forgotten on the table between us. Paul picked them up mechanically, like he'd forgotten why they'd seemed so important an hour ago. You can keep those, I said. I'll sign them tomorrow. His head snapped up. You will. Of course. You're right, we want different things. You want someone strong enough to carry you through life without expecting anything in return. I want someone soft enough to love me back. Paul stood slowly, still clutching the papers. Kim, maybe we should talk about this more. I mean, we've been together 8 years. That has to count for something. It does count for something. I walked to the front door and opened it. It counts as 8 years I'll never get back. He paused at the threshold, looking back at the kitchen table where the red file still sat open, its contents scattered like the pieces of his former life. I never meant for things to turn out this way, he said quietly. I know, I replied. That's exactly the problem. After he left, I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I didn't collapse with relief or rage or grief. Instead, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in the sudden silence of my house now according to Ashley's will, and marveled at how peaceful it felt. For the first time in 8 years, I didn't have to worry about someone else's mood, someone else's needs, someone else's disappointment in my softness. I could just be still and healing and enough. The stillness of my house lasted exactly 3 days before Paul's desperate campaign began. It started with a phone call to Hartwell and Associates at 7 a.m. on a Tuesday. I knew because Mr. Hartwell called me immediately afterward, his voice carrying a mixture of amusement and professional irritation. Mrs. Chen, your former husband seems to believe there was some sort of irregularity in your mother-in-law's will execution, he said carefully. He's demanding we review the psychological evaluation, claiming Mrs. Ashley was under undue influence. I was standing in Ashley's former kitchen, my kitchen now, watching morning light stream through windows that suddenly felt too big for one person. And what did you tell him? That Mrs. Ashley underwent the most thorough competency evaluation I've seen in 30 years of practice. 3 different psychiatrists, 2 independent attorneys, and a videotaped statement of intent. It's more bulletproof than Fort Knox. I could practically hear Paul's frustration through the phone lines. For someone who'd spent years taking shortcuts and expecting others to clean up his messes, the discovery that some things couldn't be manipulated or charmed away must have been crushing. He also mentioned something about contesting on grounds of emotional manipulation? Mr. Hartwell continued, clearly struggling to keep disapproval out of his voice. Emotional manipulation, I repeated slowly. That's rich coming from him. Indeed. I told him he was welcome to waste his money on a legal challenge, but that the evidence supporting Mrs. Ashley's decision-making capacity could fill a small library. After I hung up, I found myself laughing, actually laughing, for the first time in months. Paul was so accustomed to bending reality to fit his narrative that he couldn't comprehend a world where consequences existed. The next assault came through his father, Michael. I learned about it when Ashley called me that evening, her voice tight with an emotion I couldn't quite identify. Paul visited Michael today, she said without preamble. Showed up at the house unannounced, demanding Michael talk sense into me. I set down the box of Paul's belongings I'd been packing, clothes he'd left behind, books he'd never bothered to take. How did that go? About as well as you'd expect. Ashley's voice carried a grim satisfaction. Michael told him, and I quote, "You turned your back on your mother when she needed you most. Now you want to cry over inheritance? You're not just cruel, you're foolish." I stopped packing entirely. Michael had always been a man of few words, choosing each one with surgical precision. For him to call his own son cruel was tantamount to excommunication. Paul apparently tried to explain about work stress and financial pressure, Ashley continued. Michael asked him how much money it would have cost to visit his dying mother. Paul couldn't answer that one. The social fallout began gradually, like dominoes falling in slow motion. It started with Marcus and Jennifer Walsh, the couple we'd known since college. Jennifer had been my maid of honor. Marcus was Paul's former roommate and closest friend. They'd invited us to their annual 4th of July barbecue every year for 8 years running. This year I got an invitation. Paul didn't. "We heard about everything," Jennifer confided when I called to RSVP. "About your surgery, the divorce, all of it. Marcus said he couldn't look Paul in the face after what he did to you. People are talking?" "Honey, of course people are talking. You gave your kidney to save his mother's life and he repaid you with divorce papers. That's not exactly something you keep quiet about." Jennifer's voice carried the sharp edge of righteous anger. "Marcus tried calling Paul last week to give him a chance to explain. Paul's explanation was that you were too emotional about the whole thing. Too emotional. About saving his mother's life. About being abandoned during my recovery. About being discarded like yesterday's newspaper after 8 years of marriage. We're done with him," Jennifer said firmly. "A lot of people are." She wasn't exaggerating. Over the following weeks, I watched Paul's social circle evaporate with startling efficiency. The monthly poker games at Tom's house continued without him. The weekend golf foursome at the country club became a threesome. Even casual acquaintances seemed to cross the street when they saw him coming. I learned about his financial struggles through unexpected channels. Sarah from the bank called me about a mortgage payment that had bounced. Apparently Paul had listed me as an emergency contact years ago and never updated it. "I'm not responsible for his debts anymore," I told her gently. "We're divorced." "Oh. I'm so sorry, I had no idea." He seemed quite agitated when we spoke yesterday about the overdraft fees. That evening, driving past the apartment complex where Paul had moved after leaving our house, I saw his silver BMW in the parking lot with a bright yellow boot on the front wheel. The car he'd been so proud of, the one he'd spent hours detailing every weekend, the one he'd never let me drive because I wasn't careful enough with nice things. 2 weeks later, the BMW was gone entirely. I found out it had been repossessed when I ran into Paul's former neighbor at the grocery store. "Saw them tow his car last Tuesday," old Mrs. Henderson said, shaking her head sadly. "Such a shame. Always seemed like such a nice young man." I wanted to correct her, to explain that nice young men don't abandon their wives after major surgery, but what was the point? The truth had a way of revealing itself without my help. Meanwhile, Ashley was blossoming in ways I'd never expected. Her new apartment was a revelation. Bright, airy, filled with plants and natural light. She'd chosen furniture that actually reflected her personality instead of trying to maintain the formal, museum-like atmosphere Paul had always preferred in his childhood home. I haven't felt this free in decades, she told me one afternoon as we hung cheerful yellow curtains in her living room. Do you know, I never realized how much energy I was spending trying to manage Paul's moods. Always walking on eggshells, always making excuses for his behavior. I understood completely. The absence of Paul's constant low-level criticism had created space for parts of myself I'd forgotten existed. I was rediscovering my love of cooking, trying recipes I'd avoided because Paul found them too ethnic or too complicated. I was reading books again instead of spending my evenings managing his schedule and soothing his professional disappointments. You know what the strangest part is? Ashley continued, stepping back to admire our handiwork. I keep waiting to feel guilty about cutting him out of the will. But I don't. I feel relieved. Relieved. Relieved that I finally stopped enabling him. Relieved that I chose the person who actually deserved my love instead of the one who expected it. She turned to face me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Paul never grew up, sweetheart. But you became the daughter I always hoped to have. The words hit me with unexpected force. I'd spent 8 years trying to earn Paul's love, trying to prove I was worthy of his attention and affection. But Ashley's love, real, unconditional, chosen love, had been waiting for me all along. I love you too, Mom, I whispered, the word feeling natural and right on my tongue. Some family is blood. Some family is choice. The best family, I was learning, is both. As we stood in her sunny living room, surrounded by the evidence of new beginnings, I realized Paul had lost more than money or property. He'd lost the chance to be part of something beautiful, something real, something that would have sustained him through whatever challenges life might bring. He'd chosen to walk away from love, and love had chosen to walk away from him. The justice in that was almost poetic. The poetry of justice was beautiful, but healing, real healing, required something deeper than satisfaction. It required me to rebuild myself from the foundation up, to discover who Kimberly was when she wasn't constantly accommodating, explaining, or apologizing for someone else's choices. The realization came gradually, like morning light creeping across a room. I didn't hate Paul. The emotion I'd expected, rage, betrayal, the desire for revenge, simply wasn't there. Instead, I felt something more complex and ultimately more freeing. Pity. Hate would have required energy I no longer wanted to spend on him. It would have meant carrying his poison in my bloodstream, letting his selfishness continue to shape my thoughts and choices. Paul had already hollowed out his own life with decades of taking without giving, of expecting without appreciating. I didn't need to push him into the hole he'd dug. I just needed to stop trying to pull him out of it. The first sign of my recovery wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday morning in late spring when I woke up in my sunny bedroom and realized I hadn't thought about Paul in 3 entire days. Not with anger, not with hurt, not even with curiosity about what he was doing or how he was managing. He'd simply faded. I want to plant a garden, I told Ashley that afternoon over tea in her bright kitchen. Something permanent. Something that will grow. Her face lit up with an enthusiasm I'd rarely seen during her years of managing Paul's emotional distance. I've always wanted to try gardening again. I used to have the most beautiful rose bushes before your father-in-law decided the yard needed to be practical. We spent that weekend at 3 different nurseries, Ashley moving through the rows of plants with the focused intensity of a woman reclaiming lost dreams. She'd stop at certain flowers, touch their petals gently, and share memories I'd never heard before. White roses, she murmured, cradling a potted bush like a baby. My grandmother grew these. She said they represented new beginnings. She looked at me meaningfully. I'd like to name these after her, Eleanor. The purple tulips were for Ashley's mother, Margaret, who died when Ashley was barely 20. The yellow daffodils honored my grandmother, the only woman who'd ever made me feel unconditionally loved before Ashley came into my life. Each plant became a memorial, a reclaiming, a deliberate choice to fill our lives with beauty instead of emptiness. As we worked in the garden behind Ashley's apartment building, the landlord had been delighted to let us transform the neglected patch of earth. I found myself talking about things I'd never shared with Paul. Dreams I'd buried. Fears I'd carried. The person I'd been before I learned to make myself smaller to fit into his world. You know what I really want to do? I said one evening, dirt under my fingernails and satisfaction in my chest. I want to write about this. About what it feels like to give everything and get nothing back. About what it's like to discover you're worth more than someone else's convenience. Ashley looked up from the lavender she was planting. For peace, she'd said. Then write. The blog started anonymously. Letters to my former self. I called it, posting weekly essays about kindness and betrayal, about the difference between being soft and being weak. I never used real names, never shared identifying details, but I told the truth about what it felt like to love someone who couldn't love you back. The response was overwhelming. Women from all over the country wrote in with their own stories. Tales of husbands who disappeared during medical crises, of partners who took and took until there was nothing left to give, of the slow awakening that came with recognizing your own worth. Your story about the hospital flowers made me cry, one reader wrote. My husband brought me wilted gas station roses after I gave birth to our third child, then complained about having to leave work early to drive me home. I thought I was being ungrateful. Now I realize I was being human. Another email simply said, I've been waiting 30 years for someone to tell me it was okay to stop trying to fix someone who doesn't want to be fixed. Thank you for giving me permission to choose myself. Word by word, story by story, I was taking my voice back. Not the small, accommodating voice I'd used with Paul, but the clear, honest voice of a woman who'd learned to value her own experiences. My birthday arrived in July, marked by Ashley with homemade strawberry cake and a letter that made me weep with gratitude. She'd written it on her good stationery, the kind she'd saved for special occasions. Dearest Kimberly, it began, 32 years ago. I gave birth to a son I thought would bring me joy. Instead, he brought me disappointment. Today, I'm celebrating the daughter I never gave birth to but somehow found anyway. If I could go back and choose who to raise, it would be you. Happy birthday to the best gift I never knew I needed. All my love, Mom. I kept that letter on my bedside table, reading it whenever I felt the old doubts creeping in. The doubts Paul had planted about being too soft, too giving, too much. Ashley's words were antidote to 8 years of being told I wasn't enough while somehow always being too much. The garden was blooming beautifully by August when Paul made his final appearance in my story. I was watering the roses. Eleanor was producing stunning white blooms, when I heard a car door slam in the front parking lot. Through the kitchen window, I watched him approach my front door. He'd lost weight, looked tired, but there was something different about his posture. Less arrogant. More uncertain. He knocked softly, not the demanding rap I remembered from our marriage. I stood perfectly still, watching through the lace curtains Ashley had helped me hang. Paul waited on the doorstep for nearly 10 minutes, occasionally glancing at his phone, shifting his weight from foot to foot. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out what looked like a folded piece of paper, slipped it under the door and walked away. I waited until his car disappeared around the corner before approaching the door. The paper was a single sheet torn from a legal pad, covered with Paul's careful handwriting. Kim, I know you won't see me and I understand why. I wanted to apologize. I've had a lot of time to think about what I did, what I lost. I was wrong about everything. You weren't too soft. I was too hard. You weren't too much. I was too little. I hope you're happy. You deserve to be. P. I read the note twice, then walked to the kitchen and dropped it in the trash. Not out of anger but out of completion. His apology, sincere as it might have been, wasn't something I needed anymore. It was a period at the end of a sentence in a book I'd already finished reading. The chapter containing Paul Chin had ended. The story of Kimberly, just Kimberly, was still being written, and it was turning out to be far more beautiful than I'd ever imagined possible. The story of Paul's downfall reached me in fragments over the following months, scattered pieces of information that painted a picture of a man who had learned nothing from losing everything. Jennifer Walsh called me in October with news she'd gleaned from her husband's reluctant conversation with their mutual friend Tom. He's telling people you manipulated his mother against him, Jennifer said, her voice tight with disgust. Claims you took advantage of an elderly woman's gratitude to steal his inheritance. I was sitting in Ashley's living room at the time, watching her teach her book club how to make proper English tea. The women, 6 lovely ladies ranging from 60 to 75, had become like aunts to me, each one protective and fierce in the way only women who've survived disappointment can be. Let him tell whatever story helps him sleep at night, I said, genuinely unbothered. The truth doesn't need his permission to exist. But Paul's version of events revealed everything about who he truly was. Even faced with the consequences of his own actions, he couldn't accept responsibility. In his mind, he was the victim. Cheated, betrayed, unfairly punished for crimes he couldn't even see clearly enough to acknowledge. The details of his new life trickled in through various sources. Sarah from the bank mentioned seeing him at the unemployment office. Mrs. Henderson reported that he'd moved into a boarding house on the wrong side of town, the kind of place with weekly rates and shared bathrooms. Marcus Walsh, who'd once considered Paul his closest friend, told Jennifer he'd spotted him working at a discount electronics store, looking defeated behind the counter. "The irony isn't lost on me," I told Ashley one evening as we prepared dinner together. "He used to complain about my hand-me-down furniture, said it made us look cheap. Now he's sleeping on a mattress someone else threw away." Ashley paused in her chopping of vegetables. We were making her grandmother's vegetable soup, a recipe she'd finally felt ready to share. "I don't take pleasure in his suffering," she said carefully. "But I can't pretend I'm surprised by it either." He was right, of course. There was no satisfaction in Paul's decline, only the inevitable conclusion of a life lived without genuine connection or generosity. He'd spent 34 years taking without giving, and now he was discovering what happened when the well of other people's kindness finally ran dry. My blog had grown into something larger than I'd ever imagined. What started as anonymous letters to my former self had become a community of women supporting each other through the aftermath of emotional abandonment. I'd received over 3,000 messages, each one a testament to the fact that my story wasn't unique, just rarely spoken about. "Your post about learning to sleep alone was exactly what I needed," one recent email read. "I kept thinking something was wrong with me for feeling relieved when he finally left. You helped me understand that relief isn't betrayal, it's healing." Another woman wrote, "I've been married to my Paul for 15 years. Reading your stories gave me the courage to start planning my exit. Thank you for showing me what's possible on the other side." I'd started hosting monthly meetups at Ashley's apartment. Women who'd found my blog and wanted to connect in person. We'd gather in her sunny living room, sharing stories and strategies, tears and laughter. Ashley would make tea and listen with the wisdom of someone who'd spent decades enabling before finally choosing differently. "You know what I love most about these gatherings?" Ashley asked after one particularly emotional evening where a woman named Carol had shared her story of leaving a 20-year marriage to a man who'd never once asked about her day. "Everyone leaves lighter than they arrived." It was true. There was something powerful about speaking your truth to people who understood, about having your experience validated by women who'd lived through variations of the same betrayal. Winter arrived early that year, and with it came an unexpected piece of news. Tom Miller, Paul's former poker buddy, approached me at the grocery store with obvious discomfort. "Kim, I thought you should know. Paul's been asking around about you," he said, glancing nervously toward the exit. "Wanting to know where you live now, if you're seeing anyone. It's concerning." My first instinct was fear, the old familiar tightening in my chest that came from years of walking on eggshells around Paul's moods. But then I remembered who I'd become. Not the soft, accommodating woman who'd once absorbed his anger like a sponge, but someone who'd learned to set boundaries and enforce them. "Thank you for telling me," I said calmly. "If he asks again, you can tell him I'm doing wonderfully and I'd prefer to keep it that way." The knowledge that Paul was still thinking about me, still trying to find ways back into my orbit, should have been unsettling. Instead, it felt like confirmation of something I'd suspected all along. He'd never really understood what he'd lost until it was gone permanently. On Christmas Eve, Ashley and I established what would become our most cherished tradition. We spent the morning baking cookies for her neighbors, then the afternoon delivering them with handwritten notes. In the evening we exchanged gifts, small thoughtful things that reflected how well we'd come to know each other. Ashley gave me a first-edition copy of Jane Eyre, inscribed with a quote that made me cry. "I am no bird, and no net ensnares me. I am a free human being with an independent will." She'd written beneath it, "For my daughter who learned to fly." I gave her a custom photo album filled with pictures from our garden, our cooking adventures, our book club meetings. On the first page I'd written, "For the mother who chose me back." That night, as we sat by her Christmas tree, modest but beautiful, decorated with ornaments we'd made together, I realized something profound. Paul had given me the greatest gift possible by leaving. He'd freed me to discover that I was worth choosing, worth loving, worth fighting for. Just not by him. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he'd been different?" Ashley asked, her voice soft in the lamplight. I considered the question seriously. Sometimes. But then I remember that who he was made me who I am. And I like who I am now. The moral I carried in my heart had crystallized over these months of healing. Kindness isn't weakness. It's the most dangerous strength of all. It had taken me 8 years to learn that lesson, but now it was etched into my bones. I'd given Paul my heart, my health, and my unconditional love. He'd given me betrayal and abandonment. But in the end I'd won. Not because I'd fought back with equal cruelty, not because I'd sought revenge or tried to destroy him. I'd won because I'd walked away while he stood still, trapped in the same patterns that had always defined him. I'd chosen growth while he chose stagnation. I'd chosen love while he chose loneliness. And that made all the difference. The whisper of that victory was louder than any scream, more powerful than any roar. It was the quiet sound of a woman who'd learned her worth and refused to accept anything less. It was the sound of coming home to myself. If this story of quiet triumph had you holding your breath, smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Kimberly slid that red file across the table and Paul finally had nothing to say. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more powerful stories of strength and justice like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.